HMS Barham was one of 5 Queen Elizabeth-class super-dreadnoughts built for the Royal Navy in the 1910s, being the 4th ship laid down. In the Second World War, she served first in the Mediterranean Fleet and was then transferred to the Home Fleet in December of 1939, where she had her first near-fatal encounter with a U-boat, U-30, which managed to hit Barham in the bows, keeping her in the docks until April of 1940. As the war in the Mediterranean expanded, Barham assisted in the decisive Battle of Cape Matapan, helping to sink 3 Italian heavy cruisers. However, what she is most famous for is when, on the 25th of November 1941, as she was steaming in a single line with Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, supporting operations off the Libyan coast, she was struck by 3 torpedoes fired from U-331. Hitting so close together, a large hole was torn in her port side. Not even 5 minutes later, as the ship rolled over onto her side and her crew desperately tried to escape the doomed ship, a large explosion occurred, ensuring her doom. This explosion, the plight of her crew, and the final loss of the ship was all captured on film, making it a uniquely tragic tale. Out of her large crew, 862 men were killed. Of these were 56 officers and 806 ratings, while around 400 men were saved. In late 1941, the battle raged in North Africa between Allied and Axis forces. The Mediterranean fleet, although battered and bruised from the evacuation of Crete, convoy operations to Malta, and acting in support of Allied land forces on the African continent, the fleet was out supporting land forces late in the month of November, as Italian convoys were heading to North Africa with supplies for Rommel's Afrika Korps and other Axis soldiers. Force K from Malta, consisting of the cruisers Aurora, Penelope, and the destroyers Lance and Lively, and Force B from Alexandria, consisting of the cruisers Ajax, Neptune, the destroyers Kimberley and Kingston, sortied to meet the Italian forces on the 23rd of November. Force K intercepted and sank the Italian convoy on the 24th. However, Vincent P. O'Hara, in his book The Struggle for the Middle Sea, The Great Navies at War in the Mediterranean Theater 1940 to 1945, has this to say. The risk involved in every sortie was demonstrated 2 days later. Admiral Cunningham, pressed by Churchill, who wired his naval commander on the 23rd, stopping of these ships may save thousands of lives apart from aiding a victory of cardinal importance, had sailed with the Mediterranean fleet to support further sorties of Force K and Force B. The Mediterranean fleet was out in force, including the battleships Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, and Barham, while a threat to the battleships lurked beneath the waves in the form of a German U-boat, U-331, commanded by Hans-Diedrich von Tiesenhausen. German U-boats in the Mediterranean were proving to be an issue, just like in the Atlantic, with their introduction in September and reinforcements in November 1941, sinking major warships like the carrier HMS Ark Royal, while she helped to deliver Hurricanes to Malta earlier in November. Von Tiesenhausen was a seasoned sailor, having been on numerous U-boat patrols in the Atlantic. However, U-331 was his first command, and he had gone on several previous patrols with U-331 with little success. This more successful patrol for U-331 began from the Greek island of Salamis, where the U-boat had some work done and made its way south towards the North African coast, where U-331 was informed of the Mediterranean fleet's sortie from Alexandria and how they were intended to support the disruption of Italian convoys. For several days, the boat maneuvered as destroyers moved overhead until the early afternoon of the 25th of November, when an Italian plane flew overhead. As the U-boat surfaced at 2 p.m., faint smoke could be seen over the horizon, and at 2:41, destroyers and 3 battleships could be made out. As the distance decreased between U-331 and the oncoming battleships, von Tiesenhausen ordered his boat to dive and began to maneuver his way through the screen of destroyers when at 4:20, the now or never moment came for von Tiesenhausen, as he had to pick a battleship to fire at. The first he could not reach a shooting position for, and so he turned his attention to the second, and fired a spread of torpedoes, of which 3 struck HMS Barham. U-331 was fired at and forced her to crash dive to a depth well beyond what she was intended to go to, and survived the damage. Von Tiesenhausen would go on to do more patrols until U-331 was sunk in November 1942, surviving the sinking of his U-boat. Barham, on November 25, 1941, on the other hand, would not. As I mentioned, Queen Elizabeth, Barham, and Valiant were sailing in a line-ahead formation at a speed of 17 knots and zigzagging. The battleships had an escort of destroyers that were supposed to protect against submarine attack. The screen did not detect U-331 when 3 torpedoes struck Barham very close together, so close that some thought it was one large hit. There was no time for maneuvers. With a ship as old as Barham and the limited amount of modernization, it's no surprise that Barham began listing to port very quickly, so much so that she was still moving forward as she continued to turn over. As the ship continued to list over and her crew tried to go over the side, Barham exploded violently, throwing men and metal into the air and having them crash down into the sea. Likely, we will never know the exact details of the explosion. Turning to British battleships 1906 to 1946, Dr. Norman Friedman discusses the official report from the Admiralty. The torpedoes hit between the funnel and the after turrets, causing the ship to list rapidly. 4 minutes after the hits, with the ship on her beam ends, there was a heavy explosion, probably between X and Y magazines. The Board of Inquiry concluded that the torpedoes had blown in the side of the ship, causing such rapid flooding that she quickly listed to 40 degrees, paused slightly, and then rolled over. The board could not be certain of the cause of the explosion, but suggested that it was due to a fire start in the port 4-inch magazine, which spread to the adjacent 15-inch magazine. By the time the ship exploded, she had already capsized. The officer of the watch nearby an HMS Valiant stated that all observers agreed that there had been 3 explosions, 1 and then 2 in quick succession, all midships between funnel and main mast. The general opinion at the time was the big explosion was the 6-inch magazine rather than A or B, as the center of the explosion was abaft the bridge. The officer thought it was forward of X and Y magazines. ADO/PCO of Barham felt 3 torpedo explosions and a 4th abreast the mainmast. Okay, there are several things to unpack in that quote, so let's put our thinking caps on and get to work. First, the general consensus is that 3 torpedoes struck Barham and that these torpedoes are the root cause of further explosions. 2, there was a further explosion separate from the torpedo hits. Third, the Board of Inquiry felt that a fire in the port 4-inch magazine spread to the adjacent 15-inch magazines and was the cause of the devastating explosion seen in the video. Fourth, the general opinion at the time of the explosion by those who witnessed it was that the big explosion was the 6-inch magazine rather than A or B, as the center of the explosion was abaft the bridge. The officer thought it was forward of X and Y magazines, with those on Barham feeling that the 4th more violent explosion abreast the mainmast. Fifth, because of these torpedoes, the ship began to roll violently and capsize. 6, I'm adding this one in for the video's sake, as some feel other causes might be at play, which we will go over. 7th, I'm also adding this one, what was the cause of the explosion? First things first, I think we can all agree that the torpedoes fired from U-331 are the catalyst for the further explosion. Moving on to the reports from those who were on the scene, which thankfully we have access to that report from the officer of the watch on Valiant, D.F. Trench, where at the end of the report, after having gone over all of the events, he ends it by writing, "All observers are agreed that, as the torpedoes hit, there were 3 explosions, a first one followed about 1 or 2 seconds later by 2 in quick succession, and that the explosions all occurred amidships between the funnel and the main mast. It was not certain what caused the final explosion, but the general opinion was that it was the 6-inch magazine. It was certainly not A or B magazine, as the center of the explosion was abaft the bridge, and I am of the opinion that it was not as far as X magazine." Looking at the footage itself, which is filmed aboard HMS Valiant, you can see what the officer of the watch is talking about, as after the main mast and superstructure dip into the water, and only a few seconds after, a large explosion occurs somewhere in the vicinity of that area. Although I will say it is hard to see where exactly the explosion originates from, since the explosion causes that thick dark smoke to emanate from the ship, not to mention the immense amounts of debris that fly up into the air, with large chunks of her hull and deck being thrown up hundreds of feet into the air. Next, taking a report found in British Battleships 1919 to 1945 by R.A. Burt, a lieutenant commander aboard HMS Barham writes, "At 4:10 hours, 25th November 1941, I took over the watch's PCO and ADO, having received reports from all the armament closed up. I entered the chart house to see the ciphers and to acquaint myself with the general situation. Soon after I entered the chart house, I heard and felt a violent explosion. I was just outside the chart house on the port side of the bridge when I felt 2 more explosions, about half a second apart. I was looking up for aircraft, so I did not see where the explosions took place. 6-inch director fouled my view aft. I continued my course to the ADP and reached the after end of the bridge when I felt the fourth explosion and saw a column of water and wreckage thrown up above the mainmast on the port side. When I reached the ADP, I observed the mainmast and that the ship had a list of 7 degrees or 8 degrees to port. Then, a submarine broke the surface, bearing red 120 about 150 to 200 yards away, pointing towards our stern. I could not communicate with the 6-inch armament from the ADP, and before I could get through to the 4-inch armament, the submarine had dived. Valiant was also foul of the range. Valiant fired a burst of pom-pom at the swirl where the submarine had dived and made good shooting, but the overs reached Barham's side. I looked after again and saw that the list increased slightly despite the fact that the ship was altering course rapidly to port. I then gave the order on lifebelts, and this was passed by SB telephone to all quarters, although we could not know whether the orders were received. I told the director's crew to come down and sent the ADP's crew down to the starboard side. At that time, the port side of the boat deck aft was underwater, and the ship was slowly turning over. We watched the water swirling over the port side of the ADP and come up to us in about 1 second. I had no control over my movements in the swirling water and expected soon to be clear. Another account comes from Lieutenant Wolf. At the time of the first explosion, I was just outside my office, which was on the port side of the ADO flat. This is the first deck above the boat deck on the bridge structure. Since I was leaving the office, I was facing aft and saw the flash of the explosion, which appeared to be immediately above the funnel. After a slight pause, 2 further explosions occurred, both slightly further aft. I crossed immediately to the starboard side, where a crowd was already gathering on the upper deck, and gave my pocket knife to an APO who's trying to unlash 2 Carly floats, which were secured at the bottom of the ladder up to the pom-pom deck. I went rapidly back to my office for my Burberry, a large overcoat, and then returned to the starboard side with some difficulty, as there already was an appreciable list. I descended to the upper deck, where the ship's company was already going over the side. I shouted to all near me to follow their example, rather unnecessarily, as there was little panic, and the men were not wasting any time. The list was steadily increasing, and as everyone about me was over the guardrail, I went over also at a point level with the forward end of the bridge and slid down to the bilge keel. By now, she was going over fast, and I reached the bottom of the ship, now on an almost vertical wall. Here I hesitated, owing to the difficulty of keeping my balance, because the final jump appeared hazardous, with the bottom coming up to meet me. It was then a big explosion took place aft. The ship plunged over so rapidly that I was flung backwards into the water with many others. After being sucked down, we eventually surfaced, and I swam over to a Carly float, which appeared close at hand. All traces of the ship had vanished. I discarded my Burberry, blew up my lifebelt, and held onto the side of the float with many more until picked up by HMS Hotspur 1 hour later. After those 2 accounts, we can address the second statement, as those 2 first-hand accounts show there was in fact a further explosion. The location of where that explosion began leaves doubt as to satisfying the statements 3, 4, and 5, as those depend on where the explosion took place, something that the first-hand accounts, the secondary sources, and the Admiralty reports disagree on. As the board could not be certain as to the cause of the explosion, but suggested that it was due to a fire started in the port 4-inch magazine, which spread to the adjacent 15-inch magazine. It is almost impossible to tell where the explosion originated from, especially from a layman's perspective. Because of all this ambiguity, it's understandable the position the Board of Inquiry took. Another piece of speculation that I've seen online and in some sources is the possibility of the boilers having a role in this further explosion. Finally getting to statement number 5. We're turning to Captain C.E. Morgan on Valiant. Our battleships were proceeding westward line ahead, with the Valiant immediately astern of the Barham and with the destroyer screen thrown out ahead of the battle fleet. At 4:23, carrying out a normal zigzag, we turned to port together, thus bringing the ships into echelon formation. Suddenly, at 4:25, I heard a loud explosion, followed by 2 further explosions a couple of seconds later. Fountains of water and 2 enormous columns of smoke shot skywards. The smoke formed an enormous mushroom, gradually enveloping the whole of the Barham except the after part, which was subsequently also blotted out as the ship slid into a vast pall of smoke. As the explosions occurred, the officer of the watch gave the command "hard to port" to keep clear of the Barham. 15 seconds later, I saw a submarine break the surface, possibly forced there by the explosion. Passing from left to right, the submarine was making to cross the Valiant's bows between us and the Barham. He was only about 7 degrees off my starboard bow and 150 yards away, though he must have fired his torpedoes from about 700 yards. As the periscope and then the conning tower appeared, I ordered "full speed ahead, hard to starboard," but with the helm already hard to port, I was unable to turn quickly enough to ram him before he crash dived only 40 yards away on our starboard side. The submarine was visible for about 45 seconds, and simultaneously with our ramming efforts, we opened fire with our starboard pom-poms. He was so close, however, that we were unable to depress the guns sufficiently, and the shells passed over the conning tower. I then gave the order amidships, again to avoid turning into the Barham, which was still underway with her engines running but listing heavily to port. As we came up on her beam, she heeled further about 20 or 30 degrees, and through the smoke, I could see all of her quarterdeck and forecastle. Men were jumping into the water and running up on the forecastle. The Barham was rolling on a perfectly even keel, with neither bows nor stern sticking into the air. For 1 minute, she seemed to hang in that position. Then, at 4:28, she suddenly rolled over violently, her mainmast striking the surface on the sea sharply a few seconds later. I saw water pouring into her funnels. There followed a big explosion amidships, from which belched black and brown smoke intermingled with flames. Pieces of wreckage flung high into the air were scattered far and wide, the largest piece being about the size of my writing desk. I immediately ordered "take cover" as the wreckage started flying, and that was the last we saw of the Barham, which had run almost a mile since the moment she was hit. The only signs left were a mass of floating wreckage. The 35,000-ton ship disappeared with unbelievable suddenness. It was only 4 minutes 35 seconds exactly from the moment when the torpedo struck until she had completely disappeared. This account and the video itself leads some to speculate that since the explosion occurs as water begins to pour down the funnel into the boilers, it caused the large, devastating explosion. The basic idea is that as the seawater entered the boiler rooms, it could cause enough steam expansion due to the pressure to furnish the explosion, or the possible catalyst for an even larger magazine explosion. Whether this is the case is something we will never know, but a theory that some suggest nonetheless. That still leaves us with number 6 still not checked off, which, like the Board of Inquiry, I will not officially check off. I think the mystery of the explosion only adds to the tragedy of the story, as in the panic of the moment, it is almost impossible to definitively say what is going on, leading to controversies like the one we've discussed today, or with other Royal Navy vessels like HMS Hood, Royal Oak, Vanguard, Invincible, Queen Mary, and Indefatigable, to name a few. For Statement 7 as well, I'll leave this one ambiguous, because like the Board of Inquiry, I just don't know. The story of the battleship Barham is often overlooked by her explosive demise, and I would recommend you watch my video on her that I will place in the description to get a better idea on what she did in her career, as she participated in several famous and important battles. One last thing that I would like to touch on is something that I've seen online, and that is the idea that Barham was an unlucky ship, especially with her history of damage and her previous brush with a U-boat disaster, and other problems that plagued the ship during her career. So much that some say she was an unwelcome assignment and crewmen didn't want to serve on her. I spent quite a bit of time trying to substantiate these claims by going through period sources, but I really struggled to find evidence of it. So take this idea of her as an unlucky ship with a grain of salt. I will say there might be a kernel of truth to this, as sailors throughout time have been a rather superstitious bunch, and the idea of a ship seeming to be unlucky might not seem too far-fetched. Whatever the case, the sinking of HMS Barham was a tragedy with the loss of so many sailors, shown in great detail through the filming of it. Thank you all for watching. Remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.